Hello, everyone. I am Hannah Forsyth. I am fairly new to the Blackheath History Forum committee. I'm a historian at the Australian Catholic University who moved to the Blue Mountains a few years ago, and it's my great pleasure to have become involved with this outfit. Unfortunately, we are not in Blackheath, as you all know. We are instead in all of our homes. But nevertheless, I want to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land, and I am on the land, as is Blackheath, of the Darug and Gundungurra people. I am in Katoomba, though. And I want to acknowledge their many thousands of years of care for this really beautiful country, and pay my respects to all elders here and elsewhere, to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So this is our first event of the Blackheath History Forum, and it's likely, looking at the COVID situation, that all of the events that we have will be online. So do keep an eye out for news on our website, and we'll give some news about the next event at the end of this session. So speaking of which, it is my great pleasure to introduce our very first speaker for the season, Gideon Haigh. And Gideon has been a journalist since 1984. And a quick search shows me that he has recently written, and I mean within the past few days, I think, for The Australian, the ABC and the London Times, but is author of more than 40 books, including quite a few about cricket. And I'm grateful that none of them cricket day, because I have to admit I know absolutely nothing about it. But the subject that is today, is of great interest to me, and that is based on this book, A Momentous, Uneventful Day, a Requiem for the Office, which is a very topical subject given our current circumstances. Though, of course, Gideon, I gather your most recent book is, in fact, The Brilliant Boy, Doc Evatt and the Great Australian Descent, which, of course, people should all also go to the Blackheath Glebe books to purchase, while you're also acquiring your copy of The Momentous, Uneventful Day. So this book follows on from this much larger book, which is The Office, which was awarded the Douglas Stewart Prize for Nonfiction in 2012, I think. Is that right, Gideon?
I think so, yeah. Yeah,
the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. So look, thank you so much for coming to join us today, Gideon. It's terrible that you can't be here in the mountains with us, but it is really terrific that we were able to get you here online nevertheless. This has been a really big 18 months or so for thinking about The Office, and I imagine that you have been drawing on your historical knowledge of this. How has COVID affected the way we think about The Office, both from its history and where we think it might be heading, do you think?
Well, it looks more like this. This is my office. This is the office that I've worked in for quite a lot of the last 25 years. And you'll notice that it also looks like my home. So it's in some respects, The Office has over the last 18 months gone full circle, because initially the office was an adjunct to the home or the farm. It was somewhere where the process of work and life were thoroughly imbricated. So in that sense, it's a natural cycle for us to take our office work with us back to where we also live. We would probably have preferred to do it voluntarily, but we've been forced to do it mandatorily. And we've discovered that it works. It works probably better than we'd imagined. Certainly 2 years ago, we would never have foreseen that we wouldn't.
Sorry, Gideon, you seem to have lost sound. Apologies. Oh, okay.
It seems that any better?
Yes.
That just happened. Better. I didn't touch a thing, I promise. And these are the things. These are the things.
It's happened again.
Unmute from time to time.
Well, I feel like this is some sort of demonstration of the way the contemporary office is working, isn't it? I don't think a meeting can go by without kind of, you're on mute.
No.
But now you are. You're. I think we can hear you now. Oh no, it's
coming and going, isn't it?
It is.
I've got this grand mic here, but maybe it's maybe if I use.
Yes, it does seem to be cutting out a little bit. Apologies, Blackheath History Forum attendees. Please talk amongst yourselves. Make a cup of tea.
I'll keep vigilantly my eye on the mute.
So, Gideon, tell me how offices came to be separate from homes in the first place.
Well, it's a good question because there's a lot to be gained, of course, by living and working in the same place. But it was an inevitable technological outgrowing of the growing scope and span of industry that eventually, as it became possible, it also became desirable for the factory owner to work somewhere separate to the smelly, vulgar, money-making enterprise that had greatly enhanced his wealth. It also became desirable to bring together office workers under the same roof. It had certain efficiency benefits. I should emphasise that there has always been office work, clerical, numerical, supervisory, and as I was saying, commercial and familial affairs have actually been side by side longer than they've been apart. There was an intermediate stage where you had things like the counting house adjacent to the factory and the smelter and the ironworks, but eventually communications technology made it possible, and bosses wanted to separate themselves from the origins of their work for social and class reasons as well as for technological reasons, and from that you move to the idea of the CBD office block where the clerical and managerial functions are concentrated.
So I seem to recall from your earlier book that we have a lot of office spaces emerging with early banking.
Yes.
What made them need office spaces attached to the bank in that way?
Well, the tradition certainly in the city of London, which was the great commercial banking sector of Britain and Europe, was that until the late 19th century, the banker lived on the premises almost as a kind of quasi caretaker, because so much of the currency was physical. It required some degree of protection, some degree of safety, guaranteed by the presence of the man in charge. But gradually, the CBD of the City of London, the bankers spilled out to the suburbs, and the daily commute became an inevitable part of office work.
And how did people get to the offices as they started to emerge in those early days?
Same way we do now: trains and trams and buses and eventually cars. And that became almost part of the office day as well. That idea of putting on your game face and going to work and gradually taking off your game face as you went home. Of course, the best loved kind of artifact of that in Australia is the famous John Brack painting Collins Street 5 p.m, where you see the everyone spilling out from their offices and heading probably towards Flinders Street Station in order to commute homewards to the suburbs. I've always found that painting kind of interesting, in that Brack preferred to do 5 p.m. rather than 9 a.m. It's actually always seemed to be a slightly more hopeful artifact of office work, rather than the kind of the symbol of existential alienation that many people conclude. These are people who are actually removing themselves from work in order to enjoy the fruits of their labours, and they're in that intermediate process between work and home that's allowing them to kind of slough off their worker's identity.
So I guess the clothes that they're wearing is evoking those pictures that I remember my father talking about, waiting at the train station for his father to come home, and all of the men coming out looking exactly the same.
Yes.
And that painting really captures some of that. What is it with that looking the same business? Was that always the case for office workers? What about the ways that people have chosen to dress to go to work?
Well, of course, originally it was a sign of distinction. It was when office workers were well and truly the minority. The idea of dressing formally, of dressing politely, of dressing in a kind of a polished and formal process was a means of distinguishing yourself from the average worker. And don't forget that, at the turn of the 20th century, probably not 1 in 30 people worked sitting down. Work was labour. Work was physical and mobile and upright. And this new style of work, office work, was a strange idea. It had no physical artifact. It kind of lacked the sort of the ennobling qualities of masculine labour. So I actually think that there is an interregnum in office work when it is a largely male affair, where the clerk is almost an emasculated being. He's a little bit like one of those E.M. Forster characters who has found his niche in society as sort of neither one thing nor the other. And the thing that, of course, changes that is the arrival in the office of women, where it brings the hegemony of the male breadwinner from the domestic sphere into the world of paid work, and kind of reestablishes the idea of almost a family environment of male and female and senior and junior. And it's the first workspace really where men and women work in parallel and in proximity, in numbers.
Yes, I liked your discussion in this book about the ways that women were typewriters, not just the machine. And
Yes,
what's the relationship between the kinds of technology and the gendering of the work in this time?
Yeah, it's interesting because women are the first knowledge workers. Women assimilate technology far, far more quickly than men. First of all, they're very good. The women first work effectively in telegraph offices, because the telegrapher often worked individually, so they were kind of safe from male coarsening, and they were also very attentive and very diligent, and they worked fast, so they worked extremely well with the telegraph. Then a common area of work for women was the telephone switchboard, where they were able to sort of move, sort of reroute and access and handle technology in a way that men weren't particularly good at. There are early experiments in male telephone switchboards, and they're not very successful because it's often young men who are easily distracted and not very organised who take those jobs. And then, as you say, the typewriter is the piece of technology that women assimilate far more quickly than men. They're actually felt to be uniquely suited to the typewriter, insofar as it reminds them of their dexterity with the piano and the sewing machine. So women are felt to have an almost unfair physical advantage when it comes to the typewriter. So that's why it becomes a kind of a menial sort of work, typewriting. It becomes a kind of a clerical process work because women are doing it.
Gosh, there were armies of them doing it too, weren't there? It's extraordinary. What difference did it make once women entered those office spaces?
Well, it was great for the office, first of all, because in some respects women were the great technological advance in office work.
Gideon, you've cut out again.
Because women performed functions so effectively and so cheaply, and they were eager, and they weren't going anywhere. They didn't need to be promoted. There was no assumption that they would be promoted. They would the glass ceiling of marriage and gradually leave the workforce. So they greatly enhance the efficiency of office work simply by their presence. And the other thing is, as I said before, it allows men to assert themselves, men to reassert their virility in the office environment by having a class of worker, female, to look down on, to order around.
Yes,
But
and, you know.
I think it is true. I think it's demonstrably true.
Yes, that's true. What about representations of women in the office? I guess that earlier Clark type that you were describing earlier, I think is best embodied by some of your Bob Cratchit type Dickens characters.
Yeah,
what about women in the office? How have they been, or how would you compare the different ways of representing men and women in the office in the literature that you've looked at?
It's a good question too. I mean, originally women were the typewriter girl was a kind of a symbol of female emancipation, female ambition, female danger, because women were being put in close proximity to men with their kind of vulgar, coarsening habits. But at the same time, they were kind of humanizing the workplace. They were making it more civilized. They were making it gentler. They were making it kinder. So they performed an important function as far as the office workspace was concerned, and that was actually used to justify their presences. That they were not only good at their work, they made work a nicer, kinder place. As long as they didn't get above themselves. There's a classic terrific novel called The Job by Sinclair Lewis from 1916, where the female character is thoroughly emancipated, and she has very, very strong views about her place in the office and the way in which she's being exploited, and she's pretty determined to make sure that everyone knows about it. But she's a very, very rare counterexample in fiction. Mostly, the office becomes a setting for romance. The office becomes a setting.
When does that happen? Does that happen straight away as soon as women are there?
Probably around about the 1920s, 1930s, and you begin to get the idea of the secretary, the secretary and the boss. This close, intimate relationship, summed up by the expressions like private secretary, that manifest how an office wife, the idea of a man having an office wife, this woman who he worked closely with, who had this very particular understanding of male needs, who served as a loyal steward, acolyte, defender, and at the margin kind of romantic interest. There's a slew of wonderful office romance stories that come out of Hollywood in the pre and post Hays Code period, and some of them are extremely bold and even slightly saucy. There's that fantastic movie Babyface with Barbara Stanwyck, where she plays a woman who's absolutely determined to get on in the office environment and basically screws her way to the top. That's the implication of the film. You see her sort of cozying up to man after man in the film, and with each assignation, the director goes to a higher floor on the building. You can literally see her, and she ends up in the boardroom being a very, very powerful figure in the company.
So what is this speaking into? I was really struck by the ways that we want to see ourselves on television in terms of our workplaces, don't we? And so is this period of Hollywood trying to show office workers what they fantasize about themselves or how they would like to see themselves, or is it speaking into fears of the wives that are at home while their husbands go to work?
Yeah, look, this is a period where I think the novelty of women in the office has begun to become accepted and people are using it as an opportunity to it's a vehicle. It's universally understood. The trope is universally understood, and it can be used for fun purposes, for playful purposes. Interestingly, after the Second World War, when, of course, a lot of women leave the workforce and return to the domestic sphere, there's a period of about 20 years where there's very little, very few representations of women in the workforce, and very, very few representations of office work at all. In fact, in a sort of a genre of sitcoms in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, the office is very seldom seen. It's the home around which drama takes place, often with the wife and mother at the centre of it and the children, and the man returns at the end of the day to sort out the chaos that everyone's gotten into, because the man hasn't been there to act as a kind of a stabilising influence.
Fascinating, isn't it? I was just trying to think of the exception from that. Where I think it's Della Street in Perry Mason from that period.
Yes, yes.
But they're very rarely in the office together, aren't they? They're out and about a lot more. Yes, so I guess that both these films and the kind of massive growth of women in the office are happening at about the same time as that expansion of scientific management. Is there a relationship between those things, or is this just because office work is expanding in general, and bosses are feeling the need to have some sort of surveillance over the office?
Well, of course, they're a perfect fit with scientific management, aren't they? Women being docile and practical and efficient and with very little labour power. Women tend not to unionise. That makes them very easy to push around. So they are the perfect cannon fodder for that first 30 years of scientific management that follows Frederick Taylor.
Yeah. And I guess, though, that scientific management is not just imposed upon office workers, is it? It's internalised as a set of values.
Yes.
How far do you think that internalisation became real for people working in offices of different kinds over the 20th century?
I mean, I think sometimes we overestimate the reach of scientific management. I mean, it looks kind of austere. It looks kind of forbidding. It looks very regimented. We know ourselves that even in the most regimented workplaces, people can always find a way of kind of subverting the system, just ever so quietly. There's a wonderful scene at the outset of that terrific film, The Crowd, by King Vidor, where the everyman character in that is in the giant room with the office desks sort of receding into infinity, and he looks like a cog in the machine, and the clock is ticking round to 5 o'clock, but then King Vidor drops the camera down on top of him, and you can see that he's actually filling out a form for a competition in a newspaper to name a new roadster. He's kind of goofing off at the same time. So that's one of the funny things about office work, is that often goofing off looks very much like office work, doesn't it? I mean, we sit in front of our screens now, and who knows what we're actually looking at? We could be looking at Facebook, we could be on Twitter, but to the uneducated eye, to the eye perhaps even of our supervisors, it looks very much like work.
And I wonder, even to us, actually, if instead of when we need a rest, we don't step away from the machine and grab a cup of tea. We kind of keep pretending like we're working in some manner. I get. What was the change? That picture of the office, of those long, straight desks in that kind of highly industrialised way that looks very similar to a factory, or else a hospital ward, I suppose, would be the other one. Yes. Our offices don't look like that anymore. How did that particular configuration of everybody facing forward like you're in a schoolroom, how did that come an end?
Well, they do and they don't, of course, because the office is still pretty rectilinear. There's still plenty of right angles in it, aren't there? And the cubicle has, in a way, replaced that kind of self-contained office. So we maintain the vestigial imprint of those old offices. And you're right to talk about the offices being a kind of inheritor of the patterns of the factory. In fact, it inherits two really important iron laws from the factory. The idea of synchrony, the idea of working at the same time, and the idea of co-location, everyone working together in the same place. And that mentality survives, I think, in the preference that bosses have had for sort of panoptical supervision. When does it begin to change? Well, I guess the most obvious period is there's a period of experimentation in the mid-1960s where everyone is looking more closely. They realise that there is actually now a big office market out there. There are people looking for better ways to organise their work, and both in Europe and the United States, people start to look at different ways to lay offices out. I guess the first there's the influence of Bürolandschaft, which is office landscaping, which comes from Germany, which is an idea inherited from cybernetics of organising work according to workflow and foot traffic within an office. The most active places kind of put together at the same time, with fewer right angles and a greater concession to aesthetics. The introduction of pot plants and partitions to make the office more kind of more like a garden, if you like. And the great disciple or great apostle of this in the United States is Robert Probst at Herman Miller, who comes up with the idea of the action office, which is a suite or an ensemble of office furniture that is meant to be adapted to different styles of work, to standing, to leaning, to sitting, to moving around. It's more dynamic, it's more portable, it's more versatile. It's meant to suit everyone. In fact, as we know, it's the kind of the harbinger of the modern cubicle, because once Action Office 2 comes along with a set of partitions, they're put together just like that, and the office kind of reestablishes itself. And the Action Office, which was actually meant to be constantly changing, like a honeycomb and a circle, it actually just becomes another system of boxes. And we know it ourselves now. It's you walk a lot of straight lines in the course of walking down an office corridor.
Yeah. And I guess it sounds a little bit like the original thought may have been descended from those scientific kitchens that they were developing. But that I guess the cubicles became a very cheap way of setting up office spaces.
Yes.
Was that because the key?
Yeah. I mean, financially, they were they enjoyed huge advantages in the US from the Revenue Act at the time. You could depreciate them much more quickly than you could fixed wall space. Wow. And of course, they took up much less space. Now, partition takes up much less space than a wall, which allows you to squeeze more people into your footplate, and you can kind of sell it. You can promote it as this idea of, oh, look, it enables collaboration. It enables communication. Look at all those free sightlines. You can shout to the person over there. And that's why I think collaboration has become hugely kind of overemphasized in modern office design, and at the expense of privacy. Because we all know, if we work in an office now, how difficult it is to get any degree of privacy at all. There's people always walking past and making a nuisance of themselves. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why going back home has actually been quite popular with people. We actually feel quite productive in the home workplace, because all of a sudden we've had restored to us those degrees of privacy that we've gradually lost over the last 20, 30 years.
There's been a lot of tensions, hasn't there, in the ways of laying out offices, of even co-locating offices near other offices and those sorts of things, where, I feel like HR managers in particular are interested in ways of making things more efficient, but keeping people under surveillance, but also facilitating some of those forms of collaboration and that kind of agglomerate effect of having everybody in one place. Whereas perhaps those of us that are trying to get it done prefer to have some of the separate. What are some of those controversial innovations that have come up? I'm thinking about things like hot desking.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. I mean, look, it is the ultimate design challenge, I think, that reconciliation of privacy and interaction. And, because personalities differ and because tasks and methods are diverse, I think a certain proportion of us will always feel uncomfortable in the office. It won't always suit us. And the open plan tends to prevail in this environment simply because of cost. And it looks good. It looks good. I can always remember when I wrote the first volume of the Office. I went up to Brisbane to see Paul Barclay from ABC Big Ideas, and he said, "Oh, look, we've got this fantastic new award-winning office. You should come in and have a look at it." I went, "Okay, all right." So he showed me around. And it looked fantastic. It looked kind of this utopian ideal of offices in Brisbane. And, with everyone looking in their individual workstations and everyone could see one another. And I said to Paul, "Gee, it looks great." He said, "Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible. You can't get a single thing done. I've had to go work from home." I thought, yeah, that's pretty right. That's the story of many an office. Hot desking is one of those things that we'll joke about in years to come, because nothing has gone out the window more quickly than the idea of sharing a workspace in this modern era of contagion. Everyone wants their own self-contained area.
Yes,
you can understand why it happened, because, of course, offices in some senses are quite inefficient. We're not always where we're working. For a lot of the time, the office is simply storage space. For basically 16 hours a day, it's storage space. Which we periodically go back to revisit. So you can understand the financial impetus for hot desking. What you can't understand is what it finds very difficult to reconcile with is people's idea of having something of their own and the reciprocal relationship they have with their employers, that they kind of, as they surrender their autonomy, they expect something from their employers in return.
Yes, it does. You can see how that problem would have emerged with the hot desk. I have to say, I've not worked in a hot desking environment since I was a PhD student, but a friend of mine who did said that it was always very difficult to find one another as well. So I wonder if we're not going to go back to the office. I've got questions about technology before we end up too much in the future. If we're not going to go back to the office, hot desking seems like a sensible way to manage the office's resources if we're going to pop into the office once a week or twice a week or once a month. Or I wonder if there might be a new future for hot desking.
Well, I think that we're certainly, because we have kind of adapted quite easily to the new rules, there's definitely change coming, probably in some sort of hybrid method of working when eventually the threat of contagion slips away. It has been kind of fascinating, hasn't it, to see how easily people have adapted to it. I think there are probably three reasons chiefly for it. We've all done something like it before. We're all familiar with the idea of working from home. We've all answered an email or taken a work phone call at home. There's also the idea that remote work is better than no work or unsafe work. Yeah. And at a period where we did feel endangered by a shared environment, the home provided a degree of safety and succor for us. And thirdly, there was a degree of novelty about it. and we could log some gains. We logged immediate gains from it, didn't we? We lost our commute. We didn't need the commute, which has always been a kind of a baneful, a bit of a nuisance. We obtained some degree of flexibility over our working life. There was less formality involved, and formality is always, we've always had a kind of an ambivalent relationship with that in a workspace, and it's comfortable working in places where you're surrounded by very familiar cues. So we've seen the best, I think, of remote work. What we haven't seen so far are the implications and inferences derived from it, and I think there are some things that that we'll begin to recognise over the next few years if remote work becomes the norm, that I think people should be perhaps a little bit more cognizant of.
Yeah. I guess in thinking, well, let's revert to what has enabled us to do this. Well, exactly the technology that we're using to do this exactly now certainly wasn't available during the Spanish flu. And I was remembering from looking at your earlier book on The Office, the PDA, which has kind of disappeared in favour of the phone, hasn't it?
Yes.
What do we understand about this technology that I guess what's their relationship between what the technology facilitates that the office used to do that it's good at and that it fails to do? I guess I work for a university that has multiple campuses. We've got Brisbane, Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney. And so we had always had meetings in this way. And so it actually was very little difference to us to start working from home. But I imagine that for some workplaces, this would have been quite a major difference. Do you have a view on what these technologies have enabled and prevented?
Look, I've worked at home for 25 years, and I've been, I've written a lot of books, so I've been pretty productive in this environment. You would have thought that I would have absolutely thrived in lockdown. In fact, I would have gotten even more work done, but I didn't. I actually found it really difficult. Really, there is a great difference between your workspace when it's voluntary and when it's mandatory. The fact that there was no alternative, I found extremely stressful. And there were periods, certainly last year, where I found it very difficult to get any work done at all. And I think that these technologies, which I sort of started using almost incessantly last year, I actually still find them stressful. And I think it's caused me to communicate less with people than I would have in the normal course of events. And I found my interactions on them much more superficial and much more inconclusive and much less satisfactory. When someone disappears from my screen, there isn't that period of withdrawing from the conversation, which is often sets the seal on your interaction. That moment of informality before you part company, that disappears, I think, in the environment of the Zoom meeting. Synchrony and co-location, which I was talking about before, they mightn't be compulsory anymore, but they are very convenient. They are assuredly and irreducibly convenient.
Yeah. And I guess of the long-term things that you imagine might be lost, I expect some of those things that happen in informal places that contribute to that agglomeration effect. That while we were walking from the office down the hallway, we had a conversation that led to a new kind of thing. Though that kind of opportunity is no longer available. It looks like you've just muted again, Gideon.
I'm back. See how stressful it is? I have to keep looking at that. Anyway, it's also, yes, you're right. Movement enforces a degree of variety on the day. Leaving home and going to work, and leaving work and coming to home allows the family to disperse and to reunite. It relieves us of that constant mutual interdependence that we have in family life. I think that going to the office and coming home from it has probably prolonged as many marriages as it's undermined. It enhances our desire. That separation enhances our desire to be together. And the home, I think, certainly my home, has aspects of sanctuary and trap about it. Now, the balance of the two is very, very delicate. Without offices, without somewhere to go and do our office work, just tends to feel the same everywhere. Just kind of tasks piped to and fro. Just a succession of formal, sterile interactions through screens.
Yeah. Well, on that less optimistic note, thank you, Gideon. Okay, I'd like to open us up for questions if we can. I've not used this technology to do this before, so I'm hoping we can manage this. I think that I can see that it's possible for people who are here, and we can't see you, which is a little bit of a shame. It looks like it's possible for you to put comments in. I think it's going to be on the right-hand side of your screen. And so if you've got questions for Gideon, then this would be a good time to begin to type those into that part of the screens. We've got Emily O'Gorman at first, and she's asking about the history of the corner office. And does this have a COVID work from home or online equivalent?
Actually, Sonia Catley makes a remark about having been in a hot desking situation where management still has their own office, but expects their reports to hot desk. Yes, absolutely right. There's a degree of there's immense status seeking within offices. There are pyramids of privilege, which are often gradations that are quite subtle and only sort of perceptible to the educated eye. But there's no doubt that every office has a pecking order, which you can discern after a while. Of course, the idea of the corner office is, this idea that you get two windows rather than one, and you get access to natural light. And there has always been a kind of an exaltation of natural light, access to natural light in offices, and a concomitant idea that if you don't have access to natural light, then you're a sort of a menial worker at the same time. Is there an equivalent in COVID? That's a good question. Yeah, who gets the kitchen, and who gets the study, and who gets the spare bedroom? I'll have to take that one on notice.
Oh, you've muted.
But when I moved into to this house, this office was originally the master bedroom, and I thought, well, I do a lot more working than I do sleeping, so I think the biggest room in the house has to become the office.
That's a good choice. I like that. I like that. And I'm a little jealous of all the books that are behind, although, of course, most of mine are now on I'm using the ebooks more than ever before. But, my bookcase is in another room, which kind of causes some loss of thought, I think, as I walk between there and here in the bookshelf. Short attention spans, perhaps. So David Povey is asking about if anyone can work from anywhere, isn't there a chance that employers may choose to employ the lowest possible worker to undertake the task, and that might not lead to work being further offshored than we've experienced so far in some sectors?
That's certainly possible. Interestingly, though, the first wave of offshoring, which took place around about 15 years ago, didn't go anywhere near as far as people suspected it would. There was that American election campaign where John Kerry denounced Benedict Arnold corporations who are relocating their back office functions overseas. It seemed at the time to be a genuine threat that a lot of service industry jobs would vanish into low wage jurisdictions. It didn't happen because, well, the economic environment was tended to not necessitate decisions like that. And also we discovered that there were genuine gains, efficiency gains to be logged from having people together in the same place, or speaking the same language, or having the same degrees of education, and having some idea of a sort of a corporate ethos. It is interesting that one of the things that is lacking from remote work is the ability to impress on workers what a company embodies, how this particular workplace might suit them uniquely, how it feels to be part of the company. Our office buildings and working spaces make for ready, robust comparisons. You can walk into an office and an office will have a certain feel. You can make an immediate assumption about, is this the kind of place that I want to work? So that's pretty difficult to impress on someone who's simply logging on in a distant location. So I think no one has yet effectively found a way to do really complex work at dispersed locations.
There is something too about the nature of collaboration, isn't there? That if we are collaborating in some everyday way,
Yes.
then sharing some of the external experiences matters, so that what our shared experience is that we are all in lockdown, we are under the same government and under whereas and I know from experience, once you bring someone who's currently in London or in Chicago into the room, your shared experiences are fewer, not only and you're managing time zones, of course, but something about that lack of shared experience, and perhaps the office artificially artificially created that.
No, I think that's true. The other thing is, I actually think that the remote work isn't fun. I think that's a real problem. There is something playful about work, and the act of getting dressed to go work allows you to put on a kind of a work persona, a slightly better version of yourself, if you like. If you're doing a job that you're actually good at, that you feel competent in, you might feel bad, you might feel bored, you might feel indifferent, you might feel distracted, but you usually look good. You look smart, laundered, directed, purposeful. That's actually why so many office relationships start, because you see the person at a best, not perhaps their best, but a best, doing something well, doing something. There's nothing more erotic than someone doing a good thing, performing a task successfully.
There's been a lot of chat about what we wear to work when we're working from home, hasn't there? With one extreme being the active wear, the other kind of no, I'm dressing for work every day, or at least someone said that they put their work shoes on even if they're still in their pajamas. That somehow the shoes.
Do you remember that fantastic New Yorker cover, which was the remote worker sitting in front of a screen? The screen was sort of side onto her, and you could see that the top half of her was dressed in, a very fetching blouse, and she had a martini in her hand, and her hair was done. But the rest of the room, as you pulled back from it, was chaos. It was mess everywhere. A sleeping pet on the ground, bookshelves in disarray. I think at some stage during lockdown, we've all felt a bit like that.
Well, you can't see the mass of books that actually I'll show you that are sitting on my couch behind me. And I will admit I am wearing my Ugg boots at the moment, so I relate to that woman entirely. What about scientific management? My impressions of HR managers are that they would continue to like to see us at work, and this makes them feel a bit better about what our work is doing. Do you think that we're going to? So my local barista said that he was working with someone to try to design a program that would fake you being at work if your boss is monitoring your screens, Now, that doesn't happen to me, but I gather that to some people it does. Do you think that this is going to be the future, kind of increased surveillance of technology?
I think it's already happening. There are all sorts of softwares out there that are designed to monitor your interaction with your screen, that are designed to take sort of screenshots of what you're looking at any particular time. Sort of electronic ankle bracelets.
So I guess who is going to be doing all this monitoring is the question. Surely this undermines our productivity gains under these conditions.
Yeah, we struggle to monitor. We still struggle to monitor productivity in an office situation. We're not producing widgets. We're often handling data. We're often handling ideas. There's no, as I said at the very outset, no physical outcome, no physical manifestation of the work that we're doing, except maybe, a report that yeah, well, that only comes from time to time. That pops out, every so often in my case. Who can tell what I'm getting done on any given day? And sometimes when I'm writing, there are those days where you feel as though you've got nothing done, but you've actually had a thought at some stage that you might get back to in 3 or 4 days' time that actually proves really fruitful and important. I would hate anyone to study my work methods. They're chaotic and disorganized and distracted, and somehow the job gets done, and it always has. But it certainly doesn't happen in a linear process. It's kind of an iterative loop where, you do a bit of work and you realize what you don't know, and then you go back to it and you fill that gap and you continue and do a bit more work. And, it's not by any means painting by numbers.
I guess it does depend on the type of work, though, doesn't it? Thinking of the 5-minute diary, some of those accountants in the 1920s were starting to take up that, and they could do that. Whereas, your work, you would be very difficult to manage in that way, I expect.
Yeah.
Another question is that what about the office workers' health? So there's been kind of a range of concerns about office workers' health over time, thinking about the concern over men's heart attacks in the 1950s. And these days, I guess we're worried about our air circulation and things in workspaces. Yes. How has this affected the ways that workspaces have changed?
Yeah, there's a chapter in the office, or a section of a chapter in my book, The Office: A Hardworking History, about sick building syndrome, which you don't hear very much of anymore, do you? It was for 20 odd years. It was a big phenomenon. This idea that the respiration of buildings was so poor that it would be easy for air conditioning systems to cause disease. Legionnaire's disease was kind of the most famous example of that. But there was a sort of a belief that our office buildings were poisoning us by all sorts of means, and not only in the air, but in the toner that we used in our photocopier, the ink that we used in our pens. It was one of those sources of sort of free-floating dread that, particularly when we're uncomfortable or we're dissatisfied, we tend to go looking for. Do you remember the epidemic of carpal tunnel syndrome from people sitting and typing at their desks? You don't hear very much about that anymore. I think the equivalent now would be things like the ways in which the domestic sphere is being shaken up by the fact that so many men and women are now at home, and what it's meaning to the allocation of domestic work. Because, as I say in the Momentous Uneventful Day, it's always mum and not dad who gets expected to take up any slack at home. Mum is always still easier for kids to interrupt. There have been several studies since lockdowns began in opposite gender to two-parent households that have confirmed a sort of an asymmetrical effect on domestic work. that women tied up at home are actually slipping backwards in terms of the allocation of domestic responsibilities.
Yeah. I guess the stress levels of people with children doing homeschooling as well seems to have become a very profound concern.
Oh man, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So Nancy Cushing has given us a question here talking about the individual office, the relationship between the individual office and the more open plan sections of workplaces. I guess there's the times where you can go into an office and close the door, other spaces that are intentionally shared, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. The sort of the cellular office that you're talking about there is an interesting artifact of the advent of the skyscraper in the United States. This idea that that the interior of the skyscraper reflected the exterior, with the idea of windows around the outside, and each one of them serving a kind of a cellular office. In those big American skyscrapers that began to mushroom in the 1920s, the floor plate was very, very standardized, and it was economically expedient for it to do so, because the economics of building a skyscraper, the degree to which the increase in the number of floors affects the requirement for the number of lifts, gives them a very, very strong sort of mathematical matrix. The skyscraper is a building designed to make money for its owners. So that cellular office is a direct outcome of the need to maximize the commercial return on ascending floors.
That's fascinating, isn't it? It's always struck me as being somehow important that those earliest offices, I'm thinking about in Collins Street there in Melbourne, that were a bit more like clubs where you're there together in some sense, and you might have your hair cut, check the papers, have something, you probably have something copied, do some posting, but you're there with other people. This idea that you need to be isolated from others seems to be
The open plan can support both a low trust environment and a high trust environment. It can support the environment where maximum supervision is maximized, but also it can support an area where everyone knows each other's business. And another of the classic open plan offices was the British Merchant Bank, where everyone was working independently on their own deals, but there was an idea that in a healthy, robust environment, that everyone should be able to look at each other's work and collaborate in that way. And a lot of those British merchant banks, I can remember still visiting them in the 1980s when I worked in London. They still look like gentlemen's clubs. And office doors were always open because everyone, and the idea was that everyone should be able to interact and cooperate freely.
Let's finish up then with thinking about cooperation like this. Where do you think that, what sorts of things might we have to think about as we look towards cooperating across in different ways now?
Yeah. Well, I think my concern about the office going forward, and I've sort of taken a more pessimistic attitude than some people where the office is concerned, because I think a lot of these optimistic perspectives from working from home are written by people who have jobs that they enjoy, and they enjoy the flexibility. But frankly, a lot of people don't enjoy their jobs. For a lot of people, even perhaps the majority of people, work's just not like that. It's a grind, and work from home is a means by which a chunk of business cost and space is shifted from employer to employee. Our hours are more flexible. Yeah, that's true. But so are our bosses' hours. We can work at times that are more suitable to us, but our overseers can also make demands on us at times more suitable to them. When a separate workspace exists, we feel as though it is in theory possible to take a principled stand against answering an email at home. When it doesn't, there are no kind of demarcations to insist on. And I also think that, yeah, sure, we've lost the daily commute, but did we really get it back? How long before the time that you save on your daily pilgrimage to work, which you might have innocently imagined becoming yours, actually becomes your employer's instead?
Yes, yes, indeed. Well, look, thank you so very much, Gideon, for coming and speaking with us today under less than perfect circumstances, but which have been enabled by the very technologies that might see our downfall. But I would like to remind everyone to please go and buy Gideon's book at the Blackheath Glebe Books, with whom we are blessed to be partnered for the Blackheath History Forum. And Kate, I think we've got a little slide showing what we're going to be doing the next time. There it is. Thank you. So our next session, given the changes that have been a result of COVID, will be this one but with Amanda Lorgeson on the complicated history of Australia's bad language, based on her new book, Rooted. So go and check out our website for details. It'll be at the first week of History Week, the Friday, the 10th of October. We're holding it at 5 p.m. because we had intended to have it at the pub, which seems like a suitable place to discuss a book about bad language. But we won't be at the pub or anywhere like the pub for some time, I suspect. But so we'll be blessed to have Amanda at that time. Thank you all for coming and for participating, and thank you very much, Gideon, for your time this afternoon. I hope you all have an excellent rest of the weekend.
Thanks a lot, Hannah.